You almost ignored the invitation. It was waiting at the reception desk when you got back to your hotel. A plain cream envelope with your name written neatly across the front, handed over with the same polite smile the receptionist had worn all week. You didn't open it until your suitcase hit the bed. Inside was a wedding invitation. Your name was printed in English, everything else in Japanese, except the date, the time, and an address somewhere outside Kyoto. No letter, no sender, no explanation. Just an invitation to a wedding that would begin in less than 2 hours. You'd spent 6 days in Kyoto for a conference. Temples, quiet streets, small cafes, far too many photographs of old wooden buildings. Nothing about that week explained this, so you carried it back downstairs, expecting an apology. She checked the envelope, checked her screen, and smiled. There hadn't been a mistake. The invitation had been left there for you, and she couldn't say who delivered it, only that the man had told her he'd wait outside. Through the glass doors, a black sedan sat at the curb, and the driver stood beside the rear passenger door, not checking his watch, not looking around, simply waiting, as though he already knew the invitation wouldn't be refused. The sensible thing would have been to hand the envelope back and forget you'd ever seen it. You walked outside instead. He bowed, opened the door, and never asked your name. You got in, and Kyoto disappeared behind you. He didn't speak once during the drive. Both hands stayed on the wheel, his eyes never left the road, and there was a discipline in the way he sat that made conversation feel inappropriate. So you read the invitation again, hoping you'd missed something. You hadn't. The paper barely bent in your hands, the lettering pressed into the card instead of printed onto it, and near the bottom sat a small black emblem, far too intricate to be decoration. It didn't look like something arranged that week. It looked like something that had been waiting. Shops became houses, houses became trees, and the car climbed into the hills outside Kyoto before turning onto a private road hidden behind rows of cedar. There was no gate. There didn't need to be. The road curved and the estate appeared, a sprawl of dark wooden buildings around an enormous courtyard, connected by stone paths and gardens kept to the millimeter. Dozens of black cars were already parked outside, each arriving with the same quiet precision as yours, the guests stepping out in tailored suits and kimonos. Nobody rushed. Nobody looked surprised. It didn't feel like a celebration. It felt rehearsed. Your driver opened the door before you could reach the handle, and as you stepped out, the conversations near the entrance stopped. Not all of them. Just enough for a few people to look at you and look away again. You had never seen any of them before in your life. So why did it feel like they'd been waiting to find out whether you'd come? You expected someone to stop you at the entrance, and nobody did. A member of staff motioned for you to follow and never asked your name, because he already seemed to know it. Inside, the noise dropped away. Hundreds of guests spread across the estate with every conversation staying low, even the children moving carefully. It wasn't uncomfortable, it was disciplined. He stopped outside a sliding wooden door, bowed, and opened it. The room was almost empty. A black suit hung against one wall with polished shoes underneath it and a wristwatch beside them, already set to the correct time. And in the corner sat your suitcase. You checked the airline tag, and it was yours. You hadn't seen anyone take it, and you hadn't noticed it was gone. On the table was a folded note with one sentence inside. It said, "Please be ready before the ceremony begins." No signature. Stitched inside the jacket, in black thread, was the same emblem from the invitation, and you had never seen it anywhere in your life. You told yourself you weren't going to put it on, then tried to imagine explaining why you'd refused. Someone invited me to a wedding, drove me into the hills, collected my luggage, and left a suit on a wall. It sounded ridiculous inside your own head. So you changed, and it fit perfectly. Not well, perfectly. The sleeves stopped exactly at your wrists, and the shoes felt like they'd already been broken in. You had never given anyone your measurements. You stood in front of the mirror trying to convince yourself this was still a misunderstanding. And what you saw instead was a man who looked like he belonged there. Two attendants led you through corridors that wrapped around still ponds and maple trees and stopped at a pair of enormous wooden doors, behind which you could hear hundreds of people finding their seats. Then they pulled the doors open. Rows of guests filled the hall in complete silence, all facing a ceremonial platform at the far end. For a second, nobody noticed you. Then the guests nearest the door turned, and heads followed one after another, until hundreds of people were looking directly at you. Not with surprise, with expectation. An usher gestured toward a single empty seat, front row, on its own, directly facing the platform. Every instinct told you not to sit there, but leaving meant walking back out through hundreds of silent faces who all seemed certain you belonged exactly where you were. So you sat down. A ceremonial bell rang somewhere beyond the hall, and every guest rose. The groom entered first. Perfect posture, perfect suit, and something else you couldn't place. He wasn't watching the door his bride would come through, and he wasn't searching the crowd for anyone. He stood like a man waiting for a ceremony to end, not one about to begin. Then the doors opened again, and the bride stepped inside. She wore a white kimono that seemed to hold the afternoon light, every movement slow, graceful, rehearsed. For the first few steps, she never looked up. Then her eyes lifted and began moving across the rows, one face at a time. She wasn't admiring the crowd. She was searching it. Her gaze passed politicians, businessmen, the older members of her own family, the bodyguards along the walls. None of them mattered to her. Then it stopped. On you. Not for a second. Long enough that you forgot the rest of the room existed. She didn't smile, and she didn't look surprised. She looked like someone confirming something she'd believed for a long time. And then she stepped off the ceremonial path. A ripple went through the hall, guests exchanging glances, even the attendants unsure whether to move. She ignored them and stopped an arm's length in front of you. She studied your face the way you'd study something against a memory. Then her eyes moved lower to the black crest stitched inside your jacket, and she gave the smallest nod. Not a discovery. A confirmation. Then she extended her hand toward you, and not to shake yours, to help you stand. You didn't know this woman, and you didn't understand any of it. Taking her hand felt like agreeing to rules nobody had explained. Staying in that seat felt worse. So you stood, and hundreds of people lowered their heads at once, not deeply, just enough to mark that something had happened. Nobody applauded. Nobody looked shocked. The ceremony hadn't been interrupted at all. It had arrived somewhere everyone except you had been expecting. She turned toward the platform and started walking, and you followed. The groom was only a few feet away when the two of you finally looked at each other, and there wasn't a trace of resentment on his face. He bowed, not to the bride, to you. You glanced behind you, certain someone more important had walked into the room. There was no one there. An elderly man stepped onto the platform. He wasn't introduced, and he didn't need to be. Every guest straightened, and even the groom lowered his head. Gray hair, simple suit, nothing about him asking for attention, and the entire room turned around him anyway. He looked at the bride, then at you, then spoke a few quiet sentences to the guests. You didn't understand a word of it. Everyone else did. You could feel the mood shift while he talked. Not celebration, not disappointment, something closer to acceptance, like a room that had prepared for two outcomes and had just been told which one it would be living with. When he finished, every guest bowed together, and you copied them a second too late. Nobody reacted, as though they'd expected you not to know. Then the old man reached into his jacket and instead of a ceremonial item, took out a photograph with edges gone soft from age. He studied it, held it beside your face, not close enough for you to see it, just close enough for him to compare, and after several long seconds, folded it again. Then he handed it to you. You turned it over. Two young men beside a river. One was Japanese. The other stopped your heart. The photograph was far too old to be you. The colors had drifted the way old prints do, and the man on the right was younger than you were now, hands in his pocket, squinting slightly against the light. You knew that squint. You'd watched it across a dinner table for 20 years. You looked again, waiting for the resemblance to break the way resemblances usually do, waiting for the jaw to be wrong or the eyes to belong to somebody else. It never broke. The longer you stared, the less impossible it looked. And that was when the bride finally spoke to you. She said, "That's your father." Your father had never mentioned Japan, not once. Not old friends here, not business here, not a family on the other side of the world quietly remembering his name for 30 years. So why was his photograph in the pocket of one of the most powerful men in the country? The old man didn't explain. He simply stepped aside. The bride turned toward a corridor behind the platform, and this time you didn't hesitate. It led into the oldest part of the estate, where the noise of the wedding thinned into nothing, and portraits lined the walls, men and women in traditional dress, some stern, some kind, everyone carrying the same black crest. This wasn't a family. It was a history. She stopped at a small garden behind the main hall where a stone bench sat beside a pond that barely moved, and for the first time all afternoon, she didn't look like a woman who had walked out of her own wedding. She looked like someone carrying something she'd never asked to carry. She told you your father came here almost 30 years ago. He hadn't been looking for her family at all. He'd simply been in the wrong place on the one day it mattered. Their family was attacked, she said. It wasn't a war. It was an ambush, and her father should have died that day. You didn't say anything. He didn't know who they were, she told you, and he didn't care. He saw someone who needed help, and he stayed. And the father in your memory shifted while she spoke. Not into a mystery, into a man who did the right thing once and never mentioned it again. When it was over, her father offered him anything. Money, a home, protection, power. And he refused every one of them. Which left the only question that mattered. If he refused all of it, why had they spent decades searching for you? Because there was one thing he asked for, she said, and she repeated it the way people repeat something they've heard their whole life. If I ever have a child, and I'm not there to protect them for me. You tried to picture him saying it. The man who repaired furniture instead of replacing it, who hated being thanked for anything. It sounded exactly like him. Her father tried to refuse, she said, telling him he'd never let a weight like that fall on another family. And your father told him real promises only matter when they're difficult to keep. So they waited. He'd asked them not to interfere with your life because he wanted you to grow up without owing anybody anything. And the rest arrived before she said it out loud. Their search began the day they learned he had died. She never explained how they found out or how they tracked you across countries, and somewhere in that garden those questions stopped feeling important. Only one still did. So you asked her, "Why now?" It was the first thing you'd said in what felt like hours. She looked back toward the hall, where the bells were still sounding, and told you her family had made another promise. This one to their own people. Her marriage was ending a rivalry that had lasted years, and it couldn't be postponed. And neither, she said, could her father's promise. The invitation. The driver. The suit. That empty seat in the front row. Every bow. A groom who watched his own bride walk away without a word of protest. None of it had happened because you were important. It had happened because a promise made 30 years ago had reached the last day it could be kept. So you told her they'd kept it. They'd found you. She shook her head and said, "Half of it. Half." Because her father always said a promise doesn't end on the day you find someone. It ends on the day you know they're safe. And that was when you understood why the invitation had felt so deliberate. They hadn't wanted to meet you. They'd wanted to see you. To find out who you'd become. To decide whether the thing your father left with them was finally finished. So you asked what happened now? The ceremony continues, she said calmly. Not like a woman whose wedding had just collapsed. but like someone describing an outcome that had always been standing quietly beside the other one. You'd leave the estate as her family's protected guest. Nobody would come looking for you. Nobody would ask you to repay a debt, and nobody would expect anything from you at all. Then she smiled a little and said, "That was your father's condition." That landed harder than anything else she'd told you. He hadn't asked them to give you money or power or a name to fall back on. He'd made them promise that even their gratitude would never turn into something you had to carry. And you finally understood why he never told you. If he had, you'd have spent your whole life feeling indebted to people you'd never met. Instead, he let you grow up believing your life belonged entirely to you. She reached into the sleeve of her kimono and took out a small wooden charm, worn smooth with age, the same crest carved into one side. Her father had carried it since the day the two of them met, she said, and he wanted you to have it. It wasn't valuable and it wasn't beautiful. It was simply old, the kind of thing a person keeps because of what it reminds them never to forget. The bells rang again, and she stood and said they were waiting. Not for you. For her. You walked back toward the hall together, and this time you understood every door that had been opened for you. The conversations faded as you stepped inside, and hundreds of faces turned. They weren't studying a stranger anymore. They were looking at the last living connection to a man their family still talked about. The old man crossed the floor, stopped in front of you, and despite his age, bowed, lower than anything you had seen all day. The room followed him, guests, attendants, bodyguards. The groom bowed with them, not because of who you were, because of who your father had been. There was nothing you could have said that would have deserved it. The ceremony resumed quietly and finished exactly the way her family had promised their own people it would. She married him. That had never been in question. The only thing in question had been whether it could begin before an older promise was settled. The groom took his place beside her, and he didn't look defeated. If anything, he looked relieved, as though he'd also been waiting for an old promise to finish before his own life could start. And that was when you understood the afternoon had never been a choice between two men. It had been a choice between two promises. One made for politics, one made for gratitude. Only one of them had survived 30 years. Outside, the same black sedan was waiting, and before you climbed in, you looked back. The bride stood at the top of the stone steps. She didn't wave. She placed one hand over her heart and bowed. The drive back felt much shorter. The city lights returned, the traffic thickened, and tourists wandered the sidewalks with shopping bags, none of them aware of what had just happened in the back of a black sedan. When the car stopped outside your hotel, the driver handed you one last envelope with a single sentence inside. It said, "Your father asked us to protect your future, not become part of it. Live your life without looking back." There was no signature. There didn't need to be. You never saw the bride again, and you never went back to that estate. For years afterward, people would notice an old wooden charm on your desk and ask where it came from, and you'd smile and tell them it was a souvenir from Japan. That answer was easier, because the truth sounded impossible. You had known him your whole life, and you had never known this. One quiet thing, done for a stranger 30 years ago and never mentioned again. And it outlived him. It crossed an ocean, and it found its way back to the only person he ever asked them to protect. You almost ignored the invitation. And if you had, you'd have gone home believing your father was an ordinary man.